Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening to those of you on the East Coast, and I guess it's good evening to those of us here on the West Coast as well. Welcome to the hearings of the International Commission of Inquiry on Systemic Racist Police Violence Against People of African Descent in the United States. These hearings are a process by which witnesses can present accounts of the unjustified killings and maimings of unarmed Black people and Black people more generally by police officers in the United States before an international panel of human rights experts. We will now begin the hearing in the case of Kayla Moore. My name is Priscilla Ocen, and I am the rapporteur for today's hearing. Presiding over this hearing is Commissioner Arturo Fournier, who is a commissioner coming to us from Costa Rica. The witnesses for today's hearing are our attorney Adante Pointer, who assisted in representing the family. But before we hear from attorney Pointer, we will see a video recording from Maria Moore, who is Kayla Moore's sister. There will be 50 minutes for this hearing. Witnesses will testify, followed by a period of questions from our commissioner, Commissioner Fournier. I will note the 30-minute mark as well as the 45-minute mark to just kind of keep us on track, not to be rude or to interrupt anyone. So now I'd like to ask our commission staff to begin the video of Maria Moore, Kayla Moore's sister. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Moore, and I'm here to talk about my sister, Kayla Moore. Kayla was killed in Berkeley, February 12th, 2013, when her roommate called for a wellness check. So Kayla had been living in Berkeley all her life. You know, she was able to find affordable housing in San Francisco, but she was too far from us. And, you know, my dad was so intent on keeping a watchful eye on her that when she got her Section 8 help in Berkeley, we were just so happy to have her close and accessible. Within 6 months of her being in Berkeley, she was killed. And she was killed by the police. So a wellness check, unfortunately, involves the response of not only a mobile crisis, but the police. And that is something that we desperately need to eliminate. There's no reason at all why cops with guns need to be counselors with people in crisis, because we know that they don't have the tools and they don't want to have the tools to de-escalate and to take the time with someone in crisis. And that's what happened exactly that night. And it wasn't just because, you know, Kayla was in distress, mentally disabled. It was because she was Black. It was because she was transgender. That led to her death. They didn't understand her. You know, when she opened the door, she thought the officer was someone else. She thought she was talking to a different person, a friend of hers, and she didn't understand the information that was being provided to her. Because what they were telling her was that she was being arrested. So her roommate calls for a wellness check. And yet the officers who arrived say, no, we're arresting you on a warrant. So how did they find that warrant? They actually did a warrant check before they went and talked to her. And what they found was a warrant, an invalid warrant for someone with Kayla's birth name, but there was an incorrect date of birth. It was someone that was 28 years older than Kayla. And everything was not a correct warrant, and it was invalid, and they knew it, but they still used it. So they told Kayla, you have a warrant and we're taking you to jail. And Kayla was adamant that she did not have this warrant. I was actually from another county as well. So she turned to make a phone call. She said, I'll take care of this. And she turned to make a phone call. That's when the officer grabbed her hand. Kayla pulled back, and within seconds, 6 officers were on top of her, trying to put her into what was called a wrap device. If you're familiar with the wrap device, it's a torture device. You basically hogtie the person. And the wrap device is not for people who are overweight. And, Kayla was a big girl. So with 6 officers on top of her, putting her in this torture device, they realized at some point she had stopped moving. Now, granted, they had to make sure they were okay. They were checking on each other, but they failed to check on Kayla. Because her last breaths, her last words were, "Get off me, I can't breathe." And they ignored her cry for help. And when they realized that she was dead, they didn't attempt to do the CPR they would have done for one of their own cops. They didn't do the mouth to mouth. And that's so important to get the air to the brain. And it's part of their training. And they didn't do that. And it's been a long 8 years. And we're still fighting for justice and change. And we will get it. I am hopeful, confident that this will happen. And it's not going to happen because of the city of Berkeley or the police chief, who's horrible and needs to resign immediately, wants this. It's because the community wants this. And that's the amazing part. The community has come together and decided to create their own specialized care units. And this specialized care unit will be equipped with firefighters and, not police officers, but someone with an ambulance, because a mental health crisis is a medical crisis. If someone was having a heart attack, you would call for an ambulance. If someone is in a mental health crisis, you should be able to call for an ambulance, not cop. So, and what we've learned, especially in Oakland, is that mobile crisis teams don't feel comfortable without the cops. So we are utilizing the fire department as a way to make sure that the scene is safe and that the individual is safe. And I feel hopeful because this is exactly what we need to do. So I hope you guys understand how important it is, especially if you are caring for a loved one who is mentally disabled, to understand what resources are out there for you, what's available, and that you do have other options if you do have a loved one, a friend, a neighbor who is suffering and having a mental health crisis. So, in my dream world, if Kayla would have lived, she'd be in the streets protesting for Black Lives Matter. She would be out there with her girls just tearing it up and, going door to door. That's how she was. She did not give up. So I'm going to end with this. When you say her name, you give her a voice. When you say her name, you give that voice to life. When you say her name, you're demanding justice for her death. When you say her name, the community understands that calling the police on a Black woman can be a death sentence. My sister is Kayla Moore. Had she been alive, she would be cooking dinner for her roommates, watching her favorite TV crime shows, and laughing at all her jokes. And Kayla, I always love to give blessings, so I'm going to say goodbye and blessings to you.
What a powerful statement from Maria Moore. Kayla Moore's sister. Please, I think we've been joined now by attorney Adante Pointer. Mr. Pointer, please express our condolences to Ms. Moore and our thanks for taking the time to record that statement and to humanize her sister when the state so often tries to dehumanize Black folks who are killed by agents of the state. So we thank you, we thank her for her courage and for her strength in recording that statement and sharing her sister's story with us. Commissioner Fournier, I'd like to now turn to our witness, attorney Adante Pointer. Mr. Pointer, can you confirm your name for the record?
Yes, my name is Adante Pointer, A-D-A-N-T-E, Pointer, P-O-I-N-T-E-R.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pointer. And do you attest or swear that the testimony that you provide to this commission will be true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, I do.
Thank you, Mr. Pointer. You can proceed with your comments.
Yes. When I first heard and then contacted the family about the death of Kayla Moore, the family's pain and grief, as you just heard from Kayla's sister, was also real, but it was also the type of pain and grief that sparked outrage in myself as well as in many people in the city of Berkeley. City of Berkeley is thought to be a very progressive place, thought to be a very inclusive place, thought of as being a place where the community has fought for and won over the respect and cooperation of police officers so that they would engage in a more peaceful and constitutionally consistent policing. But when we delved into what took place here, what was evident from reviewing the facts of the record is that this was not a situation where officers followed their policy, followed their training, followed good judgment. Instead, this was a situation where we had a woman who was in the midst of a mental health crisis, but that in and of itself did not mean that her rights were abandoned or that her rights were not to be respected. Instead, what we saw take place here in reviewing the record is the cops received a very basic run-of-the-mill call about essentially a domestic disturbance going on. And the person who was reporting that styled themselves or told the operator that they were the roommate of Kayla and that they thought Kayla needed to be 5150, which essentially means to be detained on a mental health hold, and that Kayla had not been taking her meds. So the basis of what we have going on here is the police come to the scene of Kayla's apartment where she was lawfully present. And when they arrived, they did not hear, see, or receive any information at that point in time that Kayla was presenting a threat to anyone. They did not hear an argument. They did not see any signs of a physical altercation. No one was injured. No one claimed to have been injured. And when they approached Kayla's apartment, which was in an apartment building, and they knocked on the door, Kayla came to the door. So there was no resistance during this situation. Instead, there was compliance. And Kayla, when she came to the door, answered the officer's questions while standing in the doorway, the threshold of her home. The officers beckoned her out of the threshold of the doorway to her home, and she found herself on the landing, essentially right in front of her apartment on the landing. And in talking to the two assembled Berkeley police officers, they questioned her as to what was going on, what was taking place, and it was apparent to them by way of her responses that she was in the midst of some sort of mental health crises. But that in and of itself, just because you are experiencing a mental health crisis, does not mean that that empowers officers to use force against you. nor does it empower officers to remove you from your home. The standards for doing that under the law here in California under a 5150 mental health hold is that you either have to be a threat to others, a threat to yourself, or incapable of providing the most basic of needs and essentials for yourself, i.e., if you're standing out in the cold and you're unclothed, or you're ready to run out in traffic, or you have no place to stay. And so, therefore, it is in the best interest of yourself as well as the public that the police detain you involuntarily and bring you into custody. Once again, Kayla was at her own home. She was essentially minding her business. There is no law that I am aware of that says you cannot be in your own home minding your business, being delusional or not, and but as long as you're not harming anyone, threatening harm, or doing those things, suicidal acts or things of that nature, which means an officer has a right to then remove you from your home and bring you into custody. But that's exactly what happened here. And during the course of talking to Kayla, the Berkeley police officers were asking her questions, and she was responding in a way that was consistent with her not recognizing them as being police officers. She wasn't quite sure what was taking place, but she was scared and she was afraid, and she was being confronted by agents of the state. And she wanted, once they essentially had told her to come outside and it became apparent to her that they were going to arrest her on this quote unquote warrant, she wanted to and asked, hey, this doesn't seem right. This warrant is for a person that's not me. I don't have a warrant. And lo and behold, the record showed upon investigation that the warrant was for a person that was 20 years her senior, same name, but and was out of a different county, or essentially not in and from Berkeley. Berkeley police officers are trained that they are supposed to confirm and verify that the warrant is in fact valid and fits the description of the person that they're going to take in on said warrant. When the Berkeley police officers went to do that, dispatch gave them the information that I just told you, that the warrant did not match her age and was not from out of in the same city. And yet the officers still persisted in wanting to detain Kayla. This is important for two reasons. As I mentioned, the warrant was not on its face consistent with who she was. And on top of that, what was also important is that the officers are trained in California that when you're dealing with a person who is suffering through a mental health crisis and is in need of medical help, not punitive or criminal punishment, that you're not to threaten them with arrest, because that does not de-escalate the situation. That is only throwing gasoline on a fire. And that is exactly what the officers proceeded to do. They threatened her with arrest on a warrant that she didn't believe was true, in which she requested perhaps more rational and more common sense than the officers, was to say, hey, I want to place a call to make sure that this warrant is really for me, because this is not true. What the officers did at that point, as opposed to continuing to talk and use effective communication, which is what they're trained to do based upon police officer standards and training here in California, they ignored their training. And instead, the two officers looked at each other, made a signal or a sign, and one of the officers proceeded to grab Kayla unannounced, no warning, no ask for consent, grabbed her about her arms and tried to yank her out of her apartment so that they can then place her in handcuffs. Foreseeably, the result was that Kayla tried to pull away from the grasp and into her home. And there was no imminent threat or danger here, as she had not threatened anyone. She hadn't made any mention of doing harm to herself. Once again, it is important to understand she was at home. The officers then proceeded to ratchet up their use of force. And as opposed to just maintaining a perimeter at her front door or continuing to use some form of communication, they elected to use force. Kayla was not a slight person. Kayla was relatively large for her physicality. And so when she pulled back into the home, the officers who refused to relent went into the home with her, and they fell down onto the floor, partially on a mattress, which the mattress was over or essentially underneath Kayla's chest. So she was partially laying on the mattress and partially on the floor of her own apartment. When officers called for backup and assistance, 4 other officers came to the scene, and they proceeded to push, pull, compress Kayla's body onto the ground, which led to her being in physical distress and caused her, as for anyone, to have a greater need for oxygen because of the physicality of what was taking place. Them trying to force her to submit to their authority in her home under the guise of at one moment, a supposed warrant that was not valid. And then upon further litigation, saying, well, we were just using the warrant as a guise to get her to comply, when what we really wanted to do was bring her in for medical assistance under a mental health hold. There was a problem with this analysis or this ruse because the officers are trained, once again, not to threaten people with arrest. And they're also trained that they're supposed to complete their analysis as it relates to their evaluation as to whether or not she qualified to be detained under a mental health hold, and then call the fire department to arrange for transportation. Instead of doing either of those things, they abandoned this supposed mental health evaluation and piled on top of her back. Officers are trained and know very well that a person who is obese, a person who has a protruding belly, if they are placed in the prone position and pressure is applied to their back, it will cause them to have difficulty breathing because their diaphragm is constrained and compressed. And therefore, if you're at the same time pulling, prodding, and essentially wrestling, if you want to use that term, with this person, it will not only increase their need for oxygen, which they will not be able to meet because they're unable to breathe because of the pressure being applied to their back, it could send a person into respiratory distress. Lo and behold, that is what happened here. And as opposed to officers relenting because Kayla was not armed, she had not reached for any weapons, as opposed to officers doing what they had done on other occasions when they had contact with Kayla and they wanted to bring her in on a mental health hold or to examine her using family contacts that they had in order to de-escalate the situation, as opposed to bringing in the friend who had made the call and using that person as an intermediary to de-escalate the situation or to be a go-between. They put that person in arrest, kicked them out of the apartment, and here was Kayla faced alone on the floor of her apartment with officers piled on top of her. During the course of the case, as I mentioned before, the officers' accounts had changed from the amount of force they used, the way in which they used the force, and the basis for the force. It went from it being a warrant to then saying we were using the warrant as a ruse in order to do a 5150 hold. It went from being we were holding her down because she was bucking and she was acting wildly. And so we had to use our force to hold her limbs down. And we were pressing down her upper back with our body. And somebody is laid, another officer, 6'3", 250 plus pounds, laid across her legs. Once we got into litigation, they understood that in and of itself was wrong. They then relented and tried to minimize the force by saying, well, I just used my hand to hold down her shoulder. We were just holding her legs at her ankles. Nevertheless, what they had to was that they did try to put her in a wrap device. And for people who may understand that, is essentially like putting somebody in a fruit roll up or rolling someone up in a burrito, but it's like a mat that you're rolled into. And so it's like a full body straitjacket is another way to put it. But that device is not proper and should not be used on a person of Kayla's size. But yet they wanted, they persisted in doing that, despite Kayla saying that she couldn't breathe. They were so committed to putting her in this wrap device and imposing their will through force on her that they ignored the respiratory distress that she was under. And that, as opposed to them understanding that if she was kicking and flailing, that was akin to a fish out of water who was struggling to breathe, versus the way in which they approached it as this is someone who is fighting our authority. There was no imminent danger here. If these officers would have used common sense, Kayla would still be alive today, in my opinion. Instead, the officers' commitment to imposing their will, to detaining her on a faulty warrant, to abandoning their training and their policies about how they're supposed to go about conducting mental health holds, refusing to involve intermediaries who could have helped de-escalating the situation, violating the sanctity of her home. Kayla died on her stomach without the dignities that anyone deserves, even an animal. Because after they noticed that she was no longer responsive, comments were made about her sexual orientation as Kayla was wearing a dress of sorts, and it had rose up, towards her waist. And as opposed to these officers going and getting the appropriate equipment in order to do CPR, they sat there and they talked about her and her sexual orientation and expressed some hesitancy of performing life-saving measures. This is the way Kayla died in her floor of her own home, alone and afraid, looking for help. And instead, she was met with brutality. She was met with indignity. And she has left an impact on the Berkeley community and certainly her family, which you have seen in that video. We then filed the lawsuit and went forward in federal court. The police officers, as far as we know, were never disciplined. The district attorney never filed any charges, criminal charges against these officers. And the federal judge cut the case, dismissed many causes of action that were brought, some under the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution, others under the ADA, American with Disabilities Act, and then also state-based, California-based causes of action under the Bain Act for assault and battery and things of that nature. The district court saw fit to say that these officers were essentially entitled to qualified immunity, that they were entitled to use force, and that if they had made any mistakes, they were the type of mistakes that the court was ready to excuse away. Needless to say, my own personal and professional opinion is that was completely out of line, improper, and resulted in Kayla's killers walking free with impunity without any criminal, civil, or employment workplace justice. That is the sad, tragic, and fully preventable story of Kayla Moore. And we look forward to her receiving the justice she so much deserves. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pointer, for that comprehensive description of events. I want to turn this over to our Commissioner Fournier, to determine if he has any questions. I'll just note that we're about 30 minutes into this hearing. We have about 19 more minutes to go. So Commissioner, please keep that in mind as you ask your questions. I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.
Before anything, of course, as the rapporteur did, please give our sympathy to the family, to Maria, for her grievance, and our heartfelt condolences.
Yes, I will.
And thank you for your explanation. You already gave information of many things I was going to ask you regarding the use of force and many other things. Nevertheless, I have a couple of questions. I heard a radio information by a person under the name Lucy Kang, and she says that they didn't refer to her as human. In this case, do you know what she was speaking about?
Yes, there was reports that the officers during the course of this situation, after they had seen that Kayla was in respiratory distress, having difficulty breathing, and had lost some consciousness, they had referred to her as an it, as an inanimate object, as something that was less than human. And, that was something that none of the officers were willing to admit to.
You're muted, Commissioner.
Sorry, I thought it was. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
All right, because as somebody silenced me. Well, you spoke that there were 2 officers at the beginning, and they request for backup, and 4 more came. So 6 police officers. In criminal law here in Costa Rica, we have something that probably you do have also in the US, I mean, in the California state, that the means used by the police or to defend yourself should be equivalent to those that are opposing you. If you're threatened with a gun, of course you can draw your gun. So do you have something of the sort? Because it doesn't seem reasonable that for just one person and 6 people could not hold her and restrain her in case she was violent, which you said she was not, of course.
Yes, supposed to be proportionality as it relates to the force that officers use. To use your example, if someone does not have a weapon and is resisting police officers, that does not entitle the officer to pull their gun and shoot them dead. Instead, there has to be some proportionality to the force that's used, and in order to justify it, in order for it to be reasonable, which was the law here at that point in time. So, by its very nature, in my opinion, when you have 6 supposedly well-trained police officers who are adding their equipment of bulletproof vests and boots and handcuffs and pepper spray and things of that nature, it did not seem to be a situation that required 6 police officers to go hands-on with Kayla, especially when you have a person like Kayla who hadn't threatened anybody, had not expressed any intent to use force, and had only expressed her disbelief that there was in fact a warrant out for her arrest.
You said that she was in respiratory distress. Was that the cause of the death?
Well, that is up for dispute if you look at both sides. But from my opinion, there is no dispute, or if there was a dispute, it was resolved by the evidence. Kayla uh, uh, experienced respiratory distress, and something that any one of us here on this call could experience if you're restrained in a way in which your diaphragm is not allowed to expand and contract and essentially get air. And at the same time, you are being put into a physical tussle, or you are exerting a lot of energy because you are being pulled and pressed down and you're excited. You have oxygen hunger. You need more oxygen in order to keep your body essentially in rhythm. And they deprived her of the ability to do that by the way in which she was restrained. Adding to that, she did have some narcotics on board, not a large amount, but even still with that, she was functioning just fine before the officers arrived. She also had an enlarged heart, but keep in mind, she was functioning just fine before the officers arrived, meaning she was breathing fine. They didn't say that she was heaving or having difficulty breathing before they went hands-on and restrained her to the ground. The city of Berkeley and their experts wanted to blame this death on what is called excited delirium, which in my personal and professional opinion is junk science. It has been debunked over and over again. And it is a phenomenon that when I took the deposition of their expert, Dr. Vilke, who sought to substantiate this phenomenon that is not recognized by the American Medical Association and is based on studies that do not replicate or duplicate and expressly do not try to incorporate what takes place in the field between people who are dealing with police officers and are being compressed and have knees in their back or focused pressure. Instead, it's junk science or a theory that is based upon people laying down who are in good health, who do not have any narcotics on board, who do not have asthma, who do not have rooting stomach or belly, and they are, and weight is gradually applied in a non-focused manner on their back. That is the phenomenon that they try to attribute Kayla's death to. But one other very important factor as to why this idea of excited delirium is just junk science, and that is that there is no case that I am aware of, and none that their expert could point to site where excited delirium has happened in any circumstance where the police were not involved. So you could have all of the same factors going on in terms of drugs on board, in terms of having the physical and medical conditions that Kayla had. And people, they cannot cite to one death that he was aware of through a study or through his own experience that would be considered excited delirium. The only ones that are able to be cited to are situations where the police are involved. And that in and of its nature shows me that this idea of excited delirium does not hold any credibility. Thank you.
Right. And another question. I don't know if it was you or I read that a friend of Mrs. Moore phoned the police directly. What is the system that you have there? You phone 911 or you phone the police? Why not a psychiatric institution?
Well, the sad thing here, the failure of our society here, the failure of our system here, is that those resources are not available to family members, to friends, or the person in distress. You are not able to directly call a psychiatrist or a mental health unit in most cities, in most towns in America. In the city of Berkeley, they did have a mobile crisis unit that would have been tasked with coming out to respond to what was taking place. The problem is they do not put, and by they, I mean the city of Berkeley, did not make this service a priority. And by that, I mean they did not fund this mobile crisis unit, give it a budget to where the mobile crisis unit is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Instead, the city of Berkeley acted as if mental crises happen within the times of as if it was a store. So the mobile crisis unit only works up until 10 o'clock at night. So if you have a mental health crisis at 10:01 p.m., the only people you can call are the police. As I think we all know here, mental health does not operate on a schedule. It does not clock into a shift and clock out on its shift at a particular time. And so that is a very significant failure from the city of Berkeley and the American justice system. Those resources should be available to people 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Do you have any sort of explanation regarding Black women, particularly transgender Black women, uniquely impacted by police violence?
Well, anecdotally speaking, if you were to go onto just using your phone or watching the news here in the United States, Black women are particularly vulnerable and targeted and have a high degree disproportionate use of force used against them by male police officers who oftentimes outweigh, are outtrained, outmuscled, and usually have even more than one police officer there putting force or using force against Black women. So we know that by just looking at what is in front of us, that this society is prepared to agree to allow and to authorize an excessive force against Black women. And we see that just as recently as last week, there was a 9-year-old girl who was crying for her father. And as opposed to the police de-escalating the situation as any parent or teacher would with the little kid, they resorted to using pepper spray, placing her in handcuffs, terrorizing her. And unfortunately, although she was 9, which is very, very young, we've seen that happen from 9 to 90 years old here in the United States.
Regarding that, I heard the news, yes, of course. Do you think that racism expresses itself worst against women, Black women, than Black men?
I think racism has no favorites. I think racism in all of its most hideous forms comes out and it targets those who they think that they can get away with abusing. If it was a 9-year-old boy, they may have done the same thing. But what we do know is that if you call yourself a civilized society, men should respect women in a way to where you don't do those type of things. I can only say that the racism that is embedded in United States law enforcement seems to enjoy inflicting pain upon Black women.
So could it be explained by
Just
her
just a
sexual?
comment, apologies, Commissioner. I just want to note that we're at the 45-minute mark, so we have about 5 minutes or a little less remaining in the hearing. Apologies for the interruption. Please continue.
Right. So I was asking you if there is any evidence or if, what you think about it. Could it be because of her sexual option that she was a transgender, that they acted worst in this case?
It certainly can be. It cannot be ruled out. And given some of the comments that were made and the actions that they took in terms of not doing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation when they saw her in medical distress, referring to Kayla as a it, you know, drawing people's attention to the way in which she was dressed, that those are factors that cannot be ignored, and certainly factors that I think should be taken into account as the way in which they decided to use force, didn't respect her rights, and then when she needed their help the most, they didn't offer it, they didn't provide it, and in terms of helping to save her life. So I certainly think that those are all factors that are at play here that led to this tragic death.
Couple of more questions. Do officers need to use a body camera in California or not?
There is no statewide law in the state of California that mandates officers use body cameras. That is part of the problem here. It should be a mandatory requirement that all police officers wear body cameras and that those cameras are on anytime they are going to contact a member of the public. Instead, what we have in our state is each individual police department can opt to have body cameras or not, and they make their own laws or rules as to when the cameras have to come on, how long they have to stay on, and whether an officer can turn it off. Most police departments do not have any punishment or discipline for police officers that fail to use the body cameras or use them improperly or cover up the lens when they have body cameras. So this is a very big
So
problem.
there was not a video.
There was not a video. I wish there was.
And were they held accountable at any extent, the officers?
No. So there was no formal accountability. And what I mean by that, they didn't face, as far as I know, any negative impact from their jobs. No criminal was filed against them. And no, our civil case did not force them to face any civil penalties. The only accountability that these officers received were as a result of the community's pressure and continuing to say Kayla's name and continuing to attend the city council meetings and going to the police department and making what took place here public. That was the only accountability.
One last question due to time. You said they had a warrant addressed to other person for other reasons. The warrant is like the ticket that you have as an officer to detain somebody, or in extreme cases, to go inside their houses. How was this justified in court?
The judge believed, well, first of all, the officers had gotten Kayla to step right outside of her threshold while they were talking to her. So she was not inside of her home right when this took place, when they decided to use force. The second thing was, under the laws here and the way the judge interpreted it, he said that the warrant was close enough to Kayla to justify them detaining her. So the judge used his discretion to justify this brutal assault.
It was inside her house. Was there any witnesses?
The officers made the only non-police officer witness leave the scene.
Right. So I think, Attorney Ocean, we don't have time.
Yes, we are out. We are overtime, as a matter of fact. So at this point, I'd like to thank Attorney Pointer for being here, for taking time out of your undoubtedly busy schedule to continue to say the name of Kayla Moore, to talk to the world about the injustice that happened in Berkeley, that happened to her community, and to her family. Again, please extend our sincerest condolences and extend our gratitude to her sister, Maria Moore, for contributing that video talking about her sister. At this point, it will conclude the hearing of Kayla Moore. We will take about an 8-minute break and resume at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern, with the case of Mamadou Cissé. Again, we'll stand in recess. Thank you, Mr. Pointer.
Thank you, Attorney Pointer.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you guys taking this up. I'll relay your feelings to the family. Thank you.
Thank you.